Imagine a field. Actually, picture two very different fields. And meet Andy, he's a farmer in ancient China.
Right.
Every morning he heads out to this huge plot, the Lord's field. But, you know, his shoulders are slumped, he's moving slow, barely scratching the surface.
Yeah, kind of grudgingly.
Exactly. Because why put in the effort? Every single bit of grain he grows there. It just goes off to some distant lord he's never even laid eyes on.
So the yield is, well, it's pitiful. There's just no motivation.
But then, right behind his little hut, there's his own small plot, his family field.
Mm-hmm.
And here Andy is like a completely different person. He's just a whirlwind, working nonstop, sunrise to sunset.
Every weed pulled, every plant tended, you can almost feel the effort.
Because this matters. Every grain from this field means his family survives. It's life or death, really.
That contrast is stark.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Andy, right? This was the reality across the whole state of Lu, over 2,500 years ago?
Yes, and the ruler, the Lord of Lu, he noticed. He saw his own vast fields looking sparse, neglected, and then he saw these little private plots just thriving.
It must have been a real light bulb moment, a fundamental insight into, well, human nature and incentives.
The old system where the state owns everything and just demands labor, it just wasn't working. Not for generating revenue anyway.
It's incredibly inefficient, unsustainable even.
So this lord, he makes this decision. It sounds simple, but it was truly revolutionary for the time.
Okay, what did he do?
He basically told Andy and the others, look, forget my fields, go home, focus on your own land and make it productive, and then come harvest time, just give me 1/10 of what you grow.
A 10% tax based on their own yield. It sounds so logical, almost modern in a way.
It does to us now, but back then, this wasn't just tweaking the rules. This was a political earthquake. It sent shockwaves through the whole system.
A seismic shift, you called it, and it completely changed the power dynamics.
That's what we're diving into today. How this one single tax reform, they called it, the first tax on the Mu, put in place 594 BC in Lu, how it just shattered the old feudal aristocracy.
And led to the rise of this whole new class of professional administrators, the bureaucrats.
Ignited centuries of absolutely brutal warfare, all centered on controlling land.
It's really amazing how changing how you collect tax can fundamentally redirect a whole civilization's path from these scattered city-states towards, eventually, a unified empire.
So let's start with that core problem, the why bother issue. It's something we still see, right, in companies, organizations.
Oh, absolutely. The principal agent problem. When your incentives aren't aligned with the bosses, or the states in this case, why go the extra mile?
Your motivation just plummets if you feel like you're working on someone else's public field.
Exactly. And the Lord of Lu saw that this wasn't just laziness, it was a systemic flaw starving the state of resources. So 594 BC, boom, the first tax on the Mu.
Meaning people paid taxes based on the actual area of land they held?
And a Mu, just for context, is roughly, 0.15 acres, about 600 square meters. So it's about measuring specific plots.
Even if the measuring was pretty basic back then.
Right. But the concept was the revolution. Because, like you said, a modern listener might just shrug and say, well, yeah, you tax land in farming societies. What's the big deal?
It seems so obvious now. So why was it such an earth-shattering idea back then? What was the prevailing mindset?
Okay, think about, say, early medieval Europe. A king didn't just tax everyone directly. Power was filtered down through layers, dukes, barons, local lords. They controlled their own patches.
Right. The king relied on them to provide knights resources. It was indirect.
Precisely. The idea of the central ruler reaching past all those nobles to directly assess and tax every single farmer's plot, unheard of. It basically cut out the middlemen.
The feudal lords?
Yeah. The ruler was saying, I'm dealing straight with the source of wealth, the land, and the people working it, not just through you guys.
Wow. Okay, that immediately sounds like a direct challenge to the existing power structure. It wasn't just about money, it was about authority.
Absolutely. A lord's power came from controlling the people and the output on the land the monarch granted him. This new tax system attacked that very foundation. The monarch was claiming a direct stake in all land.
But making this actually work, I mean, the practical problems must have been enormous back then.
Oh, immense. Huge hurdles. First off, think about the basics. Land was actually pretty abundant in many places, but people were relatively scarce.
So if you tax land area too heavily,
Farmers could just leave, pack up, move to unclaimed territory, disappear off the tax map. It was way easier to control people, to tie them to a lord or a place, than it was to accurately track and tax shifting plots of land across vast areas.
Plus, you needed standards, right? How do you weigh the grain consistently? How do you even measure the land area accurately?
Exactly, standardized weights and measures. That really only came much, much later with Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. And think about the administration. You'd need a massive nationwide bureaucracy, people to measure, record, collect, prevent cheating.
Which just didn't exist yet.
Not even close. It's actually quite similar to what happened in the late Roman Empire with the colony system.
How so?
Well, as the Roman state struggled, they legally bound farmers to the land they worked, even free farmers. Why? To guarantee labor and, crucially, tax revenue. When you can't easily track and tax the land itself, you control the person on the land.
It's that same core logic. Control the person if you can't effectively control the land. That was the mindset of the old public field system.
Right. And the methods for measuring were incredibly primitive at first. There's this phrase, il shui,
Which means?
literally to pace out the Muan tax.
Right.
They would walk the boundaries step by step to estimate the area.
Wow. You can just picture some poor official trudging through fields, trying to count his steps accurately, no proper tools, maybe just scratching notes on bamboo slips.
It shows the sheer difficulty. But even that simple, back-breaking effort kicked off this huge transformation, moving China away from being a collection of city-states toward becoming an empire.
That's a really interesting point about state foundations. You're saying city-states, like maybe Athens, are built on their population.
Often, yes. Their citizens provide the army, they pay duties on trade, their participation is the state's resource. Think military service, civic duties.
Whereas empires, like Persia maybe, are built on controlling vast stretches of land.
Exactly. Taxing the agricultural output of that land becomes the main source of wealth and power. Modern nations, arguably, are founded on sovereignty, a different concept again.
And this idea of the tax handle, the shuibian, explain that a bit more.
Think of the state's resources like a big pot. The ruler needs a tool, a ladle, to scoop resources out. That tool, that mechanism for extraction, is the tax handle. In the city-state model, that handle was geared towards people demanding service, labor, maybe a share of trade profits.
But the first tax on the move fundamentally shifted where China's tax handle was grabbing.
Precisely. It moved from demanding things from people directly to demanding things from the land they worked. A pivot from an Athens-style model to a Persia-style model, from citizens to territory.
And the consequences of grabbing that new handle were
Massive.
huge chain reactions. Externally, the focus shifted. Suddenly, land wasn't just a place to live, it was the primary source of state revenue. So competition for territory became way more intense, way more brutal.
Leading to the kind of horrific warfare and massacres we see later in the Warring States period. States weren't just fighting for glory, they were fighting for tax base.
Exactly. More land meant more power, more revenue. And internally, you couldn't run this new system with the old feudal structure.
Right, you mentioned needing bureaucracy. You needed a sophisticated, centralized administration. Record keepers, surveyors, tax collectors, answerable to the central state, not local lords. New institutions had to be built from the ground up.
Which meant the old feudal system, those layers of nobles between the ruler and the actual land, it had to go.
It had to be dismantled, often violently. That's partly why the reforms in various states during the Warring States period were so bloody. They involved stripping power and land from entrenched aristocratic families.
And the result for the ruler?
A massive increase in potential power and revenue flowing directly to the center. We see the culmination with Qin Shi Huang after he unifies China, his famous decree.
The one about the black-headed people.
Yes. Let the black-headed people register their own fields. Black-headed people meaning the commoners, everyone without titles. He's speaking directly to them.
Bypassing any remaining aristocracy entirely.
It's pure imperial thinking. The land is ultimately mine. You commoners work it, you register it with my government, and you pay me taxes based on its area. I don't care who your local bigwig used to be.
That really embodies the shift. An empire is built on controlling land, like the saying, he who conquers the country rules the country.
It's all about the territory.
But this wasn't an overnight success. You said the first tax on the mu was just the first step. How long did this struggle actually take?
It's staggering, really. From that first step in 594 BC, it took over 1,000 years for the Chinese Empire to develop a system that could truly, consistently tax land effectively, a millennium of trial and error.
1,000 years. What took so long? What were the persistent problems?
Well, the technical challenges just didn't disappear quickly. Land surveying got better, slowly. They moved beyond just pacing it out, developing things like the 1,000 square field method or using basic geometry for the boundary demarcation method.
But still primitive by our standard.
Oh, absolutely. And crucially, managing the records was a nightmare. Think about it. Land gets bought, sold, inherited, split up, merged, constantly all across this enormous empire.
Without computers, databases, or even reliable maps for much of it.
The land registers just became this chaotic mess, as historians put it. Keeping track was a problem they frankly never fully solved in the imperial era. They were always playing catch-up.
So, if direct land taxation was so hard for so long, how did they actually collect revenue for all those centuries? Did they just give up?
No, they developed a kind of workaround, a clever, if flawed, compromise system that lasted for a very long time, basically from the Han Dynasty right through to the early mid-Tang Dynasty. Hundreds of years.
Okay, what was this workaround?
The state essentially said, okay, tracking every single plot's exact size and ownership is too hard, but we can count people, more or less. So they would notionally distribute land based on population.
Like an adult man gets allocated, say, a standard 100 mo plot.
Something like that, yeah. Different systems had different amounts, like the Han's land grant system or the Jin's land occupation system or the famous equal field system used later. The details varied, but the principle was similar.
They gave out land based on heads.
And then they collected taxes based on the number of heads, usually adult males.
So taxing the person became a proxy for taxing the land they supposedly held.
Exactly. It made taxing by person almost the same as taxing by land, but it relied on counting people, which was technically easier, especially when populations were more concentrated or tied down. It was a hybrid system.
It's like if a modern government couldn't do property taxes properly, maybe they'd just say, okay, everyone notionally gets a standard apartment, now pay a flat tax per person.
That's a decent analogy. A poll tax, justified by a theoretical land allocation.
But you said this workaround was flawed. What was the big problem with it?
The massive fundamental flaw was that it only worked if the state actually had enough land to keep distributing.
And eventually, they didn't.
Right. As population grew, and especially as powerful families and monasteries accumulated vast estates, often tax-exempt legally or illegally, there just wasn't enough land left for the government to hand out to peasants.
So what happened when a peasant lost their land, maybe to debt or famine, and the state couldn't give them a new plot?
They fled. They became vagrants, bandits, or tenants working for the big landowners. The tax base collapsed, social order frayed, and you often got massive peasant uprisings. It was a recurring cycle of instability inherent in the system.
Which leads us finally to a really major shift, right? Mid-Tang Dynasty, around 780 AD, the two tax reform.
Yes, implemented by Chancellor Yang Yan. This is arguably the conceptual birth of a truly modern property tax system in China. It's a huge institutional leap.
What made it so different?
The state fundamentally changed its role. It stopped trying to be both the landlord allocating land and the tax collector. That dual role had become impossible.
So it stepped back.
It stepped back. It basically said, forget about who allocated what land. We are simply going to assess the land people actually possess, however they got it, and tax them based on that ownership and its assessed value or area.
Wow, that's a massive separation. Land ownership and taxation become distinct things.
It's a crucial conceptual separation. Like, as you mentioned, the shift in Europe from feudal dues tied to land tenure towards a national tax system based on income or property value, regardless of how you got it. The state's interest became purely fiscal.
And how did the two-tax name come about?
Simply because taxes were now collected twice a year, summer and autumn harvests, based purely on the amount of land held. More land, more tax. Less land, less tax. No land. No tax based on land.
Simple, direct, universal property tax.
In principle, yes.
So let's just recap that timeline because it's incredible. The idea starts in 594 BC with the first tax on the mu.
Right.
But it takes until 780 AD with the two-tax reform for a system truly based on taxing actual land ownership to be formally established. That's
For over 1,300 years.
13 centuries of struggle, workarounds, collapses, and reforms to get there.
It really underscores how difficult fundamental state building, especially fiscal systems, actually is. It's not just having the idea, it's building the capacity to implement it.
And even after 780 AD, was it smooth sailing? Did the system finally work perfectly?
Well, no. Even with the two-tax system in place institutionally, The practice remained a constant struggle. The core issue of accurately surveying all land and, crucially, preventing powerful, privileged groups from hiding their land or getting exemptions.
That never went away.
It remained, as the sources often lament, an unsolvable problem throughout the rest of imperial history. Wealthy families, officials, monasteries, they always found ways to underreport their holdings and evade taxes. The central government was in a perpetual battle to update the registers and enforce the rules.
So the ideal of a fair and comprehensive land tax was established, but fully realizing it remained elusive.
Exactly. The administrative and political challenges were immense and persistent.
So looking back, it all started with Andy the farmer, his motivation, or lack thereof, on those two different fields.
Yeah, that simple observation about incentives.
It sparked an idea that led to this incredible 1,000-plus-year saga of transformation, reshaping the Chinese state, fueling wars, creating bureaucracies, defining power itself around land.
It's a powerful lesson in how seemingly small fiscal adjustments can have profound long-term consequences for an entire civilization, and how states always grapple with that fundamental challenge. How do you effectively and fairly get the resources you need?
Which makes you think, considering this immense historical struggle, the technical hurdles, the political resistance, the constant fight for fairness and enforcement, what should we be prioritizing today when we think about our own tax system?
It's true, isn't it? Issues of fairness, efficiency, loopholes, measuring wealth, enforcement. These aren't new problems.
How much do those ancient challenges still echo in our modern debates about things like wealth taxes, property taxes, corporate taxes, and who bears the burden?
Are we just using more sophisticated technology to wrestle with the same fundamental issues of power, wealth, and obligation that they faced millennia ago?
Something deep to consider. Thanks for joining us on this dive.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.